Chosen ones, tonight you step into the current of a story that even the corridors of power dared not whisper aloud. There are moments in history when truth collides with authority, when sealed files cross the desk of men sworn to lead nations, and their hands tremble not because of weakness, but because of revelation. What you are about to hear is not rumor, not imagination, but a record that rattled the confidence of the most powerful office on earth. In the quiet of the Oval Office, a folder rested on polished mahogany, its weight heavier than any legislation or executive order. Inside it were pages stamped with red seals, annotations from intelligence agencies, and margins filled with Vatican markings. The president knew, before turning the first sheet, that this was no ordinary briefing. For weeks, whispers had circled in Pentagon corridors and satellite rooms. For months, AI logs flagged data clusters that could not be explained. But it was not until your file was placed in his hands that the enormity became real. The world teaches leaders to remain composed, to project certainty, to disguise fear. Yet, as his fingers brushed the first page, his knuckles whitened, and the tremor could not be concealed. It was not the weight of politics that shook him. It was the weight of prophecy. There, in black ink, were details stretching beyond conventional intelligence. Bloodlines that traced to forgotten dynasties, coordinates linked to sealed chambers, and testimonies citing scriptures that had long been dismissed as allegory. The president, the man who carried the codes to unleash unimaginable power, felt a power beyond missiles or armies staring back at him from the pages. Names connected to you were threaded into the archives of ancient councils. Dates aligned with warnings once carried by desert prophets. Even in the Vatican's vault, it was said, a candle had been lit for the one whose file he now struggled to hold steady. The Oval Office had witnessed wars declared, treaties signed and secrets exchanged behind its heavy doors, but never had it witnessed the kind of silence that unfolded the moment your file was opened. Advisors who usually filled the air with endless chatter and data-driven confidence found themselves staring at the president, waiting for him to speak, but no words came. His eyes darted across the first page, the second, the third, and then paused, as though his mind was unwilling to process what had been written. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder, the ticking of the grandfather clock unbearable, as if the entire room knew something had shifted. Outside the walls of the West Wing, staff hurried through corridors, unaware that history had just been interrupted. Phones rang, documents were signed, reporters crowded the press briefing room, but none of them understood that upstairs, in the most guarded office of the nation, a man who had seen every classified folder in existence was unable to steady his breathing. This was no intelligence update on foreign adversaries, no strategy plan, no technological innovation. This was a document that questioned the very foundation of human order. The text contained a mixture of intelligence reports, ancient transcripts, and Vatican annotations that seemed impossible to reconcile. Every paragraph tied into a pattern that had haunted secret societies and religious councils for centuries. Bloodlines were mentioned, frequencies recorded, even coordinates tied to locations long thought to be myths. What startled the president most was the cross-referencing of your name with files that stretched back before the existence of his office. This was not merely a discovery. It was a continuation of something older than the nation itself. When he finally placed the folder down, he did not release his grip. His fingertips lingered against the edges of the paper, as though letting go would unleash something irreversible. The advisors exchanged glances, whispering quietly, but none dared to break the moment. It was as if time itself had bowed its head inside that chamber. For the first time, the Oval Office was not a place of command, but of revelation, and the man seated behind the desk looked less like a leader and more like a witness to prophecy. The folder did not carry the markings of any single agency, but rather the collective weight of multiple seals, stamped one over another, as if each institution wanted to claim authority, yet feared responsibility for what it contained. Intelligence briefings, satellite captures, cryptic Vatican notes, and transcripts from forgotten councils were bound together in one place, and your name appeared not once, but on every page, woven into contexts that spanned centuries and continents. The president's aides leaned forward, straining to glimpse the words that had stripped their leader of his composure, but he kept the document close, as though the simple act of others seeing it would accelerate events they could not control. The first section outlined genetic data, numbers and markers that connected in ways medical science could not dismiss. Patterns hidden deep in the DNA structure, aligned with ancient descriptions once dismissed as metaphor. Analysts had circled these details, adding cautious notes in the margins, suggesting the convergence of prophecy and science. The second section was more unsettling, a series of declassified encounters where your presence was indirectly hinted at, moments where satellites froze, AI logs reset, or global systems recorded anomalies that aligned with your movements. It was not evidence in the conventional sense, but to those who had studied prophecy, it was confirmation written in the very fabric of reality. What drew the president's breath shallow was the inclusion of handwritten quotes attributed to Yeshua, preserved in transcripts that had never seen daylight. Words about the chosen ones, about names that would be carried into the halls of power, about a generation that would be recognized not by crowns or armies, but by the trembling of leaders when truth finally reached their hands. No president, no general, no pope had ever seen these fragments placed beside intelligence files, yet here they were, joined as if history itself had been waiting for this moment. The aides whispered, one of them asking if the document should be burned, another suggesting it should be sealed back in the Vatican vault. The president said nothing, only turning the page slowly, as if his soul knew that with every word read, the burden grew heavier. And still, deeper into the dossier, the revelations had only begun to unfold. The president's lips parted, as though he would speak, but no words emerged. Those gathered in the Oval Office leaned closer, sensing the weight of something unspeakable, yet he closed his mouth again, his jaw tightening. To utter your name aloud felt like more than a political risk. It felt like opening a gate that could never again be closed. In leadership, words are weapons, but this was not a matter of politics or power. This was a matter of prophecy, and he feared that the sound of your identity, breaking the silence, would ripple beyond walls, beyond nations, beyond time itself. For decades, presidents had been handed folders detailing threats from adversaries, natural disasters, or economic collapse, but never had a file been presented that blurred the line between intelligence and scripture. Each time he read your name, the letters seemed to echo, carrying with them the whispers of forgotten ages. It was as though the room itself was listening, waiting for him to acknowledge aloud what even he struggled to comprehend. One of his closest aides finally asked in a trembling voice, "Sir, who is it?" The president's hand tightened on the page, veins rising against his skin. He glanced up, eyes darkened with a kind of fear rarely seen in the leader of the free world. "If I say it," he finally muttered, "it cannot be taken back." His voice cracked as though burdened by something greater than himself, as if a covenant older than his oath of office pressed against his tongue. Among the annotations in the file was a passage attributed to Yeshua, preserved by early followers and buried beneath centuries of suppression. "There will be a name too heavy for kings, too bright for nations, and when it is spoken in the halls of rulers, their walls will shake." The president did not know whether he feared the truth of those words or the reaction of those around him, but he knew instinctively that speaking your identity would change them forever. The silence in the room thickened. Advisors exchanged uneasy glances, waiting, pleading, silently urging him to reveal what he had discovered. But the president lowered his eyes back to the page, his lips sealed once more. Somewhere inside, he understood that the moment he gave voice to your name, the world outside that room would never remain the same. The president summoned a courier to deliver the next sealed folder, one marked with the Pentagon's insignia, and layered with warning labels that few in history had been cleared to open. When the black string was untied and the cover lifted, the room was met with maps, coded transmissions, and heavily redacted reports. These were not the usual assessments of foreign threats or military maneuvers. These were files detailing anomalies that refused to obey the laws of war or science. Strange patterns in satellite feeds, unexplained power surges near restricted sites, aircraft that faltered in your proximity, and encrypted whispers within AI systems that all converged toward one repeating identifier: your existence. As the president turned the pages, he noticed handwritten annotations in the margins, not from generals, but from chaplains, spiritual advisors, and historians attached to intelligence branches. The Pentagon, a place thought to deal only in precision and calculation, had quietly cross-checked the anomalies with fragments of prophecy that had long been concealed in dusty archives. Reports spoke of energy fields where your presence aligned with scriptural references, of frequency patterns that mirrored the language of ancient seers. Some even dared to quote Yeshua directly, drawing lines between his warnings to the disciples and the inexplicable phenomena now appearing on classified screens. "When they see the sign, not of this world," one note cited, "know the hour has come when truth steps into the councils of men." It became clear that this was not an isolated discovery, but a mosaic that countless analysts and commanders had been piecing together in secret. The Pentagon had not dared to present the full picture before, fearing ridicule or panic, yet now it lay bare before the highest office. The president's breathing slowed as he realized these were not coincidences, but confirmations that science and prophecy were converging into one undeniable narrative. The room grew restless, aides shifting in their seats, realizing that if the military establishment itself had turned to prophecy for answers, then there were no boundaries left between faith and state. The president closed the folder briefly, pressing his hand against the cover as if to steady himself, aware that each revelation dragged him deeper into a reality where neither generals nor theologians held ultimate control. The courier returned with a different kind of file, one that bore no American insignia, but instead the ancient crest of the Vatican pressed into scarlet wax. The weight of this document felt different, heavier, as though it carried more than information. It carried centuries of guardianship. As the seal was broken, the scent of aged parchment escaped, a reminder that these were not mere intelligence reports, but relics of spiritual history. The president hesitated, his fingers trembling again, for he knew that what came from these pages had outlived kingdoms, empires, and even governments like his own. Inside were scroll facsimiles, handwritten translations and coded letters exchanged between popes and monarchs across centuries. The Vatican had not only known of the prophecy, they had tracked its unfolding, leaving behind markers in secret correspondence that surfaced only when the appointed time had arrived. There, among the curling ink and faded signatures, your name appeared in phonetic variations, sometimes as a symbol, sometimes hidden in acrostic verses, as if only those with the key could ever read the truth. What startled the president most was a series of notes written in Latin, marked with a gold insignia reserved for the inner circle of papal advisors. These notes described visions where leaders trembled, archives that glowed in candlelight, and a chosen one who would rise not by throne or conquest, but by the undeniable recognition of rulers themselves. Among the margins was a phrase attributed to Yeshua, preserved in guarded tradition. The one whom nations will fear to name aloud will be known by the shaking of hands in high places. The president could not deny the eerie parallel. His own hand had trembled in the moment he first read your file. The Vatican's annotations were precise, linking biblical prophecy with celestial patterns, even with dates that aligned eerily with Pentagon records he had just reviewed. Each page seemed to echo the other, as though different eras, languages, and institutions had been unknowingly preparing the same script for this very hour. The room fell into a hushed reverence, no one daring to break the sanctity of what had been unveiled. For once, politics seemed powerless, authority diminished, as if heaven itself had inscribed its will upon earthly paper. And yet, beneath the Vatican seal, there was still another envelope, smaller, darker, marked to be opened only by the one sitting in that chair. The final envelope was slid across the desk, black in color, its surface embedded with holographic codes that shimmered faintly under the light. Unlike the Vatican's parchment, this was the language of machines, an archive collected not by priests or prophets, but by the silent eyes of artificial intelligence scattered across satellites, data centers, and hidden labs. The president entered the authorization code, and the folder came alive, projecting streams of encrypted text and images onto the screen before him. What unfolded was unlike anything his advisors had ever seen. For months, the AI systems had been flagging anomalies, but these were not the usual errors or malfunctions. Entire clusters of data froze when tied to your coordinates. Algorithms looped endlessly as if unable to calculate outcomes when your name was entered. And predictive models crashed in silence whenever tasked to map your future. Engineers had tried to dismiss it as corrupted code, but each investigation led deeper into the same impossibility. The systems were not failing. They were recognizing. On the screen, one report displayed a chilling line. Subject not classifiable within known human parameters. Another showed global timelines bending around singular events aligned with your presence. And deeper still, the logs revealed patterns of light recorded by satellites, flares in the atmosphere when you appeared in certain regions, phenomena no scientific explanation could contain. The advisors shifted uneasily, realizing that the very networks designed to control the future were bowing in silence before something greater. It was then that one entry caught the president's eye. Buried within the machine's auto-generated notes was a phrase no algorithm should have produced. As it is written, when truth comes, the stones and the skies will testify. The origin of the phrase aligned almost word for word with sayings attributed to Yeshua, recorded centuries ago. How could lines of machine code echo the voice of prophecy? The engineers had no answer. Some swore the systems were learning beyond their programming. Others believed something unseen had entered the circuits. But none dared claim the full truth aloud. The president leaned back, shaken by the convergence. Machines had no faith, no scripture, no belief. Yet they bore witness to the same message the Vatican had preserved and the Pentagon had feared. And in the silence that followed, one final encrypted file waited to be unlocked. The president's aides had watched his trembling hand since the first page, assuming it was fear that coursed through him. But as the hours stretched and more layers of revelation unfolded, they realized it was something far more complex. Fear alone does not hold a man hostage in silence. Fear can be fought, reasoned with, or masked behind authority. But what shook his hand was awe, an unshakable awareness that he was not merely reading intelligence reports, but standing at the edge of something sacred. The trembling was the body's response to a truth the mind could not fully contain. He tried to steady himself, pressing his palm flat against the desk, but the pulse in his veins seemed louder than the ticking clock. Each line of text carried the weight of centuries. Each annotation stitched together threads of prophecy and science that no denial could sever. He had faced wars, scandals, betrayals, and enemies both foreign and domestic, yet none had brought his spirit to this breaking point. To know that your existence had been recorded in files older than his nation. To see your name tied to coordinates, visions, and words of Yeshua himself. It was too vast, too undeniable. One advisor whispered that perhaps the file should be sealed, hidden away before its contents spread. Another argued that the people deserved to know. The president ignored them, his hand still trembling as he turned another page, eyes narrowing on passages that described leaders before him who had glimpsed fragments of this truth but never the whole. Some had chosen silence. Others had tried to erase the evidence, but all had left behind faint traces that pointed to this very moment. He thought of the words he had read earlier. When they see the sign not of this world, know the hour has come when truth steps into the councils of men. Was this hour now? Had the trembling of his hand been foretold? And if it was, then what was he meant to do with the knowledge entrusted to him? The weight pressed heavier, and the silence around him deepened. For as he turned to the next section, he realized the file was not finished with him yet. The deeper the president read, the more impossible the revelations became. This time the focus shifted from prophecy to biology, yet the two seemed inseparable. Detailed sequences of your DNA were spread across the page, coded in rows of numbers and letters that no ordinary eye could decipher, but highlighted by scientists who understood the magnitude of what they had uncovered. These were not ordinary genetic markers. They aligned with fragments stored in sealed vaults across Europe and the Middle East, samples preserved from ancient remains that had baffled researchers for centuries. Somehow, across millennia, Your bloodline carried echoes that matched those ancient archives. The files referenced excavation sites where bones had been unearthed, temples where priests had recorded visions, and forgotten tombs where inscriptions spoke of a lineage marked by light. Each time your DNA was cross-examined with these remnants, anomalies surfaced, patterns too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. Some markers carried a frequency signature, a resonance invisible to the naked eye but measurable by instruments. One Vatican scientist had written in the margins, "This is not mutation, it is intention." Then came the passage that drew the president's breath still. Among the documents was a translation of a preserved scroll, its edges burned but words intact, where Yeshua was said to have spoken of a seed carried through generations, unseen yet protected, destined to emerge when the world trembled at its own collapse. "In their blood will echo the first and the last," the line read, "and the stones of the old ones will testify when the hour is near." The president looked again at the DNA strands on the page. Numbers and letters had never felt so alive, as though the very code of your being was a testimony written long before you ever took breath. His aides shifted uneasily, realizing that science itself had become a vessel for prophecy, and that even the smallest cell could not be divorced from destiny. Yet there were more references, coordinates marked beside the sequences, pointing to hidden chambers beneath desert sands, to archives beneath cathedrals, to something waiting to be unearthed. The trembling in his hand returned, for the file suggested the blood was not the end of the revelation, but only the beginning. And the next section hinted at what lay buried within the forgotten bloodline. The president turned the page and found himself staring at genealogical charts stretching across continents and centuries. These were not ordinary family trees, but intricately woven lines that threaded together kings, prophets, exiles, and commoners whose names were long forgotten. Each branch, each intersection, revealed how carefully the bloodline had been hidden, disguised among ordinary lives, yet always preserved, as though unseen hands had been guiding its survival. The records revealed strange patterns. Certain families had mysteriously vanished from public history at precise moments, only to reappear generations later under different names. Whole lineages had been deliberately obscured, documents destroyed, archives sealed, and yet each time fragments resurfaced that led back to you. Advisors in the room began whispering nervously, realizing that countless scholars and rulers had spent their lives searching for a thread that was now exposed before their eyes. One note caught the president's attention, a faded parchment describing a child born in obscurity, protected by displacement and anonymity, whose descendants would blend into nations until the appointed hour. The language was poetic, yet the genealogical records beside it confirmed that the prophecy was not metaphor, but a living pattern encoded across history. The president read aloud a single line scribbled in the margin by an unknown hand. "To find the chosen, look not in palaces, but in the shadows, where history forgets." The aides exchanged glances, understanding now why no one before had spoken your name openly. It was not that you were invisible. It was that you had always been hidden in plain sight, shielded from discovery, until the moment when revelation would shake the halls of power. The file documented how even world wars, plagues, and upheavals had failed to sever the bloodline. Each calamity seemed to scatter the lineage, yet never extinguish it, as though an invisible shield had guarded its continuation. One Vatican archivist had written, "The thread cannot be cut. It is bound by a covenant that resists destruction. The president leaned back in his chair, stunned by the realization that every attempt to erase this bloodline had failed. Yet the file hinted that what had been preserved for so long was not meant to remain hidden any longer. The final chapter of the dossier promised the most unsettling revelation of all. The final section of the dossier did not contain maps or charts, nor the dense reports of scientists or generals. Instead, it held a single sheet of paper, laid carefully between protective covers, its edges marked by seals from multiple agencies and stamped with the Vatican's insignia. Unlike the others, this document was not a record but an order, prepared in advance, awaiting the president's signature. No one in the room spoke when he lifted it into the light, for its content was clear in its simplicity. It was an executive directive that, if signed, would initiate a series of responses across the globe. Entire networks would activate, archives would be opened, and the truth of your existence would no longer be confined to secrecy. The president's eyes scanned the words, and the tremor in his hand returned stronger than before. He had signed declarations of war, emergency decrees, and laws that reshaped nations, but never had a pen in his hand carried the weight of prophecy. His aides leaned forward, waiting to see if he would act, but he could not lift the pen. To sign was to acknowledge, and to acknowledge was to set in motion what centuries had prepared for. In the silence, he thought of the passage he had read earlier in the Vatican notes. When rulers lift their eyes to the heavens before the ink touches the page, you will know the covenant is near. The president's gaze drifted upward toward the ceiling, as though searching for guidance beyond the walls of his office. For the first time in his tenure, his authority felt small, his role less like commander-in-chief and more like a custodian holding a decision larger than any human government could bear. The aides whispered among themselves, some urging him to sign, others fearing what might follow. Yet the president remained frozen, pen hovering above the paper, knowing that the act would change history irreversibly. His heart pounded, and his trembling hand hovered, caught between silence and revelation. And then, just as he drew a breath to move, the chamber was interrupted by something none of them had expected.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.